Well, I think artists in general give voice to feelings and expressions that we have a hard time articulating. That is why a particular song or a particular genre of music resonates with you as an individual, is they are articulating and giving voice to something that maybe you have felt but could not articulate.
Hi, everybody. My name is Evan.
And I'm Scott.
We are both Baptist pastors, and this is our podcast about the Bible. But don't turn it off just yet. We are not here to save your souls. We will not be telling you what to believe or how to behave, and we promise not to invite you to church. We just like to talk about the Bible, what it actually says, where it probably came from, and how it's been understood or not by different people in different times and places. We are, you can cut this out, Nick. No, this is not a bait and switch. There will never be an altar call or a come to Jesus moment. Scott and I are both people of faith, and at this point we're likely to stay that way. But if you're not, or if you find yourself reimagining your relationship to God, we hope this podcast might be helpful to you. Maybe you're agnostic or atheist or a person of another faith, and you want to know what some Christians believe. Or maybe you're a Christian who wants to know a little more about this book, where it came from, and how it came to us. Whoever you are, we hope that you will stick around and listen. But this is your warning, especially if you are or have been a person of faith. For our purposes, the Bible is not a sacred text. We are pulling it down off the pulpit so that we can find out what it's been hiding. While you're here, there is nothing you have to believe. There are no beliefs you can't question, and there are no questions you can't ask. Welcome to the unHoly Bible Study Podcast. We are excited today to be here with a guest. Dr. Jay Howard is Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Butler University, where he's also a professor of sociology. He is the author of several books, but one of them is titled The Apostles of Rock and looks at the world of contemporary Christian music. Jay, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Looking forward to the conversation.
Let's start, actually, if you're willing to share just a little bit about your background with the Bible. Is this a book that's been a big part of your life or not?
It has. I do want to qualify that I'm a sociologist, not a theologian. So when it comes to theology, I'll leave it to the two of you. But I did grow up in one of those families where we were in church every time the doors were open. Sunday morning, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights. Grew up going to youth group in a very traditional kind of evangelical denomination. Up through about, I would say, my late teens, early 20s, then began to read the Gospels and read the prophets and come to the conclusion we spend way too much time with Paul in the epistles and don't pay enough attention to what Jesus actually said and what the Old Testament prophets had to say, which steered my own personal faith and theological orientation much more toward a peace church tradition. Became very interested in a lot of Mennonite peace church theology and philosophy. Yeah. So began to question my evangelical roots and say, wait a minute, maybe we're not taking the Bible and particularly taking Jesus as seriously as we think we are.
Were the churches of your childhood or kind of those communities of origin, were they part of that journey? Did they make that easier or harder, or was it just kind of a
they were not
out?
A part of that journey. I remember once being in a Sunday school with my then fiance, later my wife, who suggested during a presidential campaign where Jesse Jackson, running for president, was this, 1984 probably, had suggested that pointing nuclear weapons at your enemies is not doing what Jesus said when he said we should love our enemies. To which one of the older adults in the Sunday school classroom looked at my wife and said, "What is wrong with your head?" Right? So you could see that moving toward Peace Church kinds of orientations wasn't necessarily well received.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit, if you would, about you mentioned the prophets, you mentioned kind of the words of Jesus in the gospel. But did your relationship with the Bible change? Maybe even the way you approached it or how you understood it as a book, as an object, did that change during that transition?
Well, I think it was a very gradual transition for me. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bible quizzing, but anybody who's never done Bible quizzing finds it to be really odd, right? Where it's, sort of these game show type competitions over particular books of the Bible. And I was a member of a Bible quizzing team when the year was focused on the book of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount. And I think that was where my transition began, was, reading the Sermon on the Mount and beginning to think, well, wait a minute, do we really take this seriously or do we not take this seriously? So that sort of began the questioning of the assumptions that the denomination in which I grew up, made about the Bible and how you apply it to your life. In, as many evangelicals, very personal, me and my Jesus kind of thing. And that's what's important, not about truth and justice and righteousness and, letting justice roll down kinds of themes. So yeah, that did change my orientation to the Bible and to faith.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about that.
Thank you.
Scott, it actually kind of reminds me, I know our journeys are kind of similar in some ways, and maybe yours especially. So, but I wonder about how does the Bible, so in evangelical communities, the Bible is almost this kind of totemic object, an object that's, at least we express all our love and admiration for, whether we really read it carefully or holistically at all. But I'm thinking about people waking up early in the morning to pore over the pages of Scripture or memorize their life verses and things. And I'm curious if either of you does the Bible still function that way for either of you as this kind of object of love?
It's always been hard for me to use the Bible in a devotional kind of a way. It was stressed, all the way through. Even into college, I was involved in Campus Crusade, but you have to have your quiet time in the morning.
Right.
So out of guilt and obligation, I tried to have quiet times, but the Bible never worked like that for me.
I think for me, the part of the transition was when a friend / mentor was actually attending the Mennonite seminary up in Elkhart, Indiana. And he made the argument, you find the Bible in other places than the pages of the Bible, right? When we say we encountered Jesus in the least of these. And I think that opened a whole new world of understanding the Bible for me.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great line.
Yeah, that actually helps me put to words. The Bible was the only source of revelation the way I grew up.
Yeah.
It's almost like the incarnation of Jesus wasn't as good as the Bible. But yeah, it was that, like you said, it was like more of a totem than a part of, I don't know, a holistic part of the faith.
Yeah. I think maybe the reason I ask is because there's been a little bit of the tension for me. Like I always have resisted that. Are you doing your quiet time? Like if you're doubting things or struggling things, it's probably because your devotional life is suffering. There's that. Sometimes that expectation is explicit. Sometimes it's kind of implied in these religious communities, and I found that to be true not just in evangelical communities, but kind of maybe in religious communities of all kinds, but definitely in mainline churches as well as evangelical Christian churches. Um, but in my life, it's always gone through kind of phases or seasons. There's times when I read the Bible a lot because I enjoy reading it, and I never do like a quiet time or have like a reading plan. But there's times when it's like I'll devour the words or keep coming back to them. And then there's years when I don't do that as much. But I think there's something about the Bible as like there is still stuff here that I love that I kind of keep coming back to as almost as a powerful object or a thing.
I remember I interviewed for a church pastorate. I don't remember if it's my first interview, but it was right out of seminary. And at one of my interviews with a search committee, I was asked the question, "What's your view of Scripture?" And I knew what the subtext of the question was. And I said, "Well, I believe the Word became flesh, not book."
Yeah,
and
Good line.
and and I don't remember where I got that quote, but I borrowed it, and I really felt like from their reaction, they immediately saw me as a heretic.
Yeah, the interview was over.
Yeah, and
Because you quoted scripture at them, that makes you a heretic.
yeah, and so yeah, it's weird how, I don't know, how we just put that book in a box.
Yeah.
Or at least the way I grew up, it was like this pre-packaged answer book.
Yeah. I think for me, it's just my relationship to words in general, because as I'm thinking about it and talking about it, I do the exact same things with poetry, with lines. We were talking about a book earlier, and I'll go back a few times a year to those things. I probably do the same thing with movies. Like I go back to these objects that have meant something really powerful to me at some point in my life to try to recapture that thing. And the Bible does work that way for me, or some parts of the Bible. I mean, some parts of it don't. But there's stuff there that still resonates with me more deeply than I might expect.
Well, the point for me when it really like made a difference in my life was in seminary when I took Greek and Hebrew. And my experience was, holy cow, I didn't know it really said this.
Yeah.
And the depth and the breadth and the semantic range and what it's speaking to, like deep levels of human experience. It just became so clear to me. And so this love of the Bible in that sense, not narrowly academic, but that fed my soul.
Yeah. I don't think we've even introduced our topic for today yet. We are talking about a chapter from the book of Amos, which is an Old Testament book, a book from the Hebrew Scriptures. We're talking about the 5th chapter of Amos. And Jay, you had already mentioned the prophets as one of the kind of maybe light bulb moments in your experience with the Bible. And Scott, I don't know if you'd start us off. How were you introduced to the Hebrew prophets? When did you become aware of them? How were they used in your earliest memories? When did you start reading them?
The church I grew up in, they were used almost exclusively for predicting the end times. That's what I thought the prophets were about, telling us the future. And I don't think I even comprehended how much justice and confrontation of power and corruption. I don't think I saw any of that again until seminary. And then I took every Hebrew class on the prophets I could. I fell in love with them so much.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jay, you'd said you kind of came to them on your own almost.
Yeah. Similar to Scott, my first recollections of the prophets are them being used in an eschatological sense, predicting the end times, or
I'd forgotten, but that's
that kind of thing.
that
But,
brought back memories for me.
yeah, but having in my late teens, early 20s, begun to read the prophets through a new lens, when I began teaching social theory, one of the people that's credited with contributing to the founding of the discipline of sociology is Karl Marx, right? And of course, my students hear Karl Marx and they think atheist who wants to take away all your property, some radical that wants to destroy society. So when we began the section of the course on Marx, I would give them sort of this multiple choice quiz using, PowerPoint. Here's a quote. Is it Karl Marx or is it the Bible? And, pulling largely from the prophets and then making them try to figure out, well, wait a minute, these two sound an awful lot alike, and maybe I shouldn't throw Karl Marx out the window, and if we find these themes that are consistent with themes in the Bible. So it was a way to get students to be willing to think that, all right, well, maybe I do need to read a little bit of Karl Marx to understand his way of seeing society.
Oh, that's great. I remember we did a long kind of unit, or we had grant funding for a program for our youth group here at the church several years ago, and we planned this multi-year program on peace, justice, and reconciliation, and part of that was a study on the Old Testament prophets, and we did a similar activity where we had lines from the prophets. It wasn't Marx, although actually Marx might have been one of the quotes we had interspersed. Yeah. Is this from the Bible or is this from something else? And I remember it being an eye-opening experience for these teenagers. Like, oh, the Bible says that? Yeah. I was trying to remember, and I mean, I have memories of like sitting in the Bible study in the sanctuary on Sunday nights, and the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, are pulled up as proof texts during your Bible study on Revelation. It says, like, that's how you interpret some of these Christian writings and New Testament writings that supposedly predict the end of the world. I'd kind of forgotten that until you both mentioned it, but those are early, complicated memories for me. And I think the civil rights movement, I've probably, as a young adult, I became more aware of the Hebrew prophets because they were quoted by Dr. King. And these lines would be used, those lines from speeches would be used as sermon illustrations, or you would hear them when you were watching the video or reading the transcripts of those speeches. And I think in some ways that was my introduction to the prophets as they actually are in the scriptures, not just as predictors of the future, but as critics of the present and the social orders in ancient Israel, and advocates for people who are poor or oppressed in the society they lived in right then.
This might be oversharing, but I'll share it anyway.
That's what podcasts are for.
But you brought a memory to mind for me. We had a prophecy conference every October in my church.
Oh, no.
And it was about it was totally the end times, figuring out when. And I specifically remember I think it was the altar call near the end of a service, and it was stressed that the return of Jesus was so close. Like, it could be tomorrow. And you better make sure you're right with God. And this thought popped into my mind: Jesus, wait till I get to have sex for the first time before you come back. That was the kind of impact that approach had on me.
I bet you weren't the only person in the room thinking that or something like that. Right. Yeah.
Now, I think that's telling about how we use the Bible, or how it's used.
Definitely. Maybe how would you, if you were talking to someone who had never read the Bible, had no idea who the Hebrew prophets were, how would you describe them now, today? What would be your kind of uh, 30-second introduction to the Hebrew prophets if somebody said, what is the book of Amos? Or what is this genre of literature?
For me, I always turn to somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. or any other people who've been social activists in our own country and history. I've used Lincoln. I say the way those people functioned in our society and the way they addressed issues like for Lincoln slavery or Martin Luther King civil rights, that's the ethos of the prophets. So if you can understand the kind of social transformation people like King wanted, that's what the prophets were pursuing, and they were constantly confronting the powers that be. That's my introduction, yeah.
Yeah, I would say something very similar, that the prophets confront the powerful and say, you're doing this, God demands that. That was the real function. But I would also say not just the powerful, but also the faithful, those that claim to be following God, and say, you claim to be following God, but God says X and you're doing Y, or you're just ignoring X. So I think prophets are about confrontation and calls for accountability.
You almost wonder if relegating it to apocalyptic, predicting the end, is the way you avoid facing that.
I think that was one of the functions of interpreting it that way.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add, and maybe what I would highlight, is that these are poems. That these are all the prophets write in poetry and use the poetic forms to deliver these messages that are exactly what you've described. And even, I mean, these are figures who are writing over hundreds of years, kind of as the society of what we call ancient Israel was evolving and changing and responding to current events. And one of the things you even see is the way, you see how art functions and the kind of the function of these artists in this time. They're religious figures, they're political figures, but they're also artistic figures. They're writers, they're creators. And you even see a little bit as the Amos is one of the earlier prophets, but then the later prophets, you even sense the shift from oral poetry to written poetry. You've got the book of Ezekiel, which is so much longer, so much more complicated, so much clearly written to be read and preserved in that way, where you also have these poems that were meant to be shared in public and out loud. And I would want people to remember that it's art.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, protest songs of the 60s are parallel to what you're saying.
Share some DNA? I think so, yeah. All right, well, we are going to dive into the 5th chapter of Amos. We're going to take a close look kind of at what this chapter actually says right after we take a break. We are back, and we are ready to take a closer look at the 5th chapter of the book of Amos. This is, I think we already said, this book in the Christian Bible is found in what we sometimes call the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. And we'll talk a little bit about the context or the history kind of as we go through it. But this is a book that begins with lamentation. Scott, for anyone who doesn't know, what does that word mean?
It's sort of the woe is me genre of scripture, or woe is us, like, oh, life is bad, or we're struggling, or why is everything going wrong, God? Why doesn't it, yeah, it's the blues of the biblical times.
Yeah. And we do think this book was written at a time when Israel had plenty to be blue about, or would very soon. Most scholars date the book of Amos to the 9th century BCE. So the time, if you know your biblical history, this is after David and Solomon, but before the exile.
And after the so-called Civil War, the split between the kingdoms.
Yeah, so during the time of David, which we talked about, I think, a couple weeks ago, Israel was all one kingdom, but then it splits into southern Judah and northern Israel. And Amos is a book. Probably Amos as a figure, as a speaker or a poet, seems to be from Judah, but he's talking to the people of Israel, right? And he says, woe is not really woe is me. It's more like woe is you.
Mm-hmm.
You've fallen. Those are some of the lines. He's talking to the house of Israel. You're fallen, no more to rise, forsaken on the land with no one to raise them up. And like any prophet, Amos is speaking for God. This is God saying to the people of Israel, your time is up.
Mm-hmm.
Something bad is about to happen. The metaphor that he actually uses is that a city with an army of 1,000 people is only going to have 100 soldiers left because this calamity is going to be that bad. We kind of know, looking back, what the calamity is that we're talking about, right? It's the end of the nations of Israel, which were destroyed, right? I don't know the history as well as a lot of people do, but around this time, we know that the northern kingdoms of Israel were overwhelmed by the Assyrian Empire. And what happened to people when, in the ancient world, what happens when your people get conquered?
They become the labor source, for one thing, of the conquering nation. They definitely aren't part of the privileged class.
Yeah.
They often the group conquered. Often they eventually take on the culture of the conqueror, even the religious perspectives of the conqueror, which was a constant struggle that Israel had throughout their history, and being influenced by those nations around them.
Yeah. So the political situation is about to change, or has just changed dramatically. I think one of the things that's complicated about the book of Amos is we don't know exactly when it was written. The Amos speaks as if these things are about to happen, but we think maybe they were written after these terrible things had already happened, and he's looking back and trying to say this is why it happened. But yeah, people would be, people die in wars, and often the people who suffer most are not the soldiers or the kings who organize these things, but it's the poorest people, the people who work the land and whose lives are totally upended. People would be taken away as slaves or as laborers. People who stayed in the land would now be ruled by someone else, whose goal was kind of just to extract money or labor or people from the people. And that's the future that Amos sees for Israel. And that's why God is lamenting over them.
Break. Jay he just called. We should.
Ready? Good. Still rolling. Is all of that recorded?
No, I put it on pause.
Nice. There's golden content in there, right? So Amos has predicted this tragedy that's about to happen. We kind of have some sense of what that tragedy is. But there's some sense here in this next section that they might be able to, the people of Israel could prevent this tragedy from happening. This refrain starts coming in. You start to sense kind of the poetic nature of this text. The refrain, seek the Lord seek the Lord and live, is repeated several times in these next few verses. Seek the Lord and live, or this terrible thing is going to happen. So there's this sense in the book of Amos that the reason the reason these bad things are happening is because people haven't been seeking the Lord. And I think that's worth talking about at least a little bit. This sense in the prophets that bad things happen because when bad things happen, it's usually because we're doing it wrong, or because people haven't been living the way God wanted them to live. Is that an idea that feels familiar to you all from your churches growing up, from your experience of the Bible? What do you make of it?
Well, I would say the way, if in that context, that focus, the way it was used was I almost felt like it was manipulating us to repent as individuals, almost like a scare tactic. If you don't do the right thing, you're going to go to hell, but it's a very individualistic approach and totally alien to what the prophets were, a transactional kind of thing.
I think that notion that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people has done more to drive people away from Christianity than maybe any other piece of folk wisdom, because often good people experience bad things in their lives and are victims of sometimes evil or corrupt individuals, but often it's about corrupt structures and systems. This is the sociologist in me coming out, right? I mean, the deck is stacked in society in favor of some and against others, and it doesn't matter how hard you work or how much you do the right things. You've got many more hurdles in your way than other people who are born into positions of more advantage.
And I think that's what is maybe interesting or maybe even hard about reading the prophets. This section is kind of, a lot of it is just a list of all the things that are wrong with the society. And most of them are not things one individual did, right? It's you trample on the poor, take from them levies of grain, like we're talking about onerous taxes, and the kind of the rich probably taking advantage of their position in society. But it's set right against this notion that you're doing all these awful things. What you really need to do is seek the Lord, which is a really vague prescription. Like, what does it mean to seek the Lord?
Well, I think in the Jewish context, even the ancient Jewish context, it's deeply tied to the Torah. You seek the Lord by embracing and following the Torah. And at least the way I've, in this point in my life, what I say is, I've always said that the Torah is like Israel's constitution.
Right.
And that if that constitution is followed, the natural outcome is a stable, rich, vibrant culture. That's the promise. And if you go this way, just culture can't function. And that's the way I've always seen it. And I think that's what the prophets are saying is, you're not pursuing God, you're not pursuing the Torah.
Yeah, so like seek the Lord. Maybe we almost have to hear that or can't help but hear that as kind of an individualistic or a call to personal piety. And you might not have heard it that way in ancient Israel when you couldn't seek the Lord by yourself. You almost had to do it together as a people. It meant following the Lord. It meant, that's the imperative here, right? It's establish justice. It's not pray harder.
Yeah. Well, even the concept of salvation, anytime salvation is talked about, it's the nation that's saved. There's nowhere in the Hebrew Bible that says the individual has to repent to be saved. It's God acting for his people. And it implies that it's something about us corporately, and that God's grace and salvation happens in that corporate context.
Man, talking that way would have gotten you kicked out of your church growing up real fast, I suspect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think it's a important context is the very intense focus on personal piety and personal salvation is a pretty modern, a fairly recent concept. So as we keep moving through this chapter, God is lamenting over Israel. God is saying, you could have done this. You could have lived this way, but instead, these are all the things you've done wrong, all the ways your society is set up to benefit a few at the expense of the many. And then this kind of maybe the core of the passage, the upshot of the whole thing is God is coming. There's this idea in the next passage. There's a line that says, there's going to be wailing in the vineyards. You should bring all the professional mourners out because God is about to come through, pass through the midst of you. And there's this great turn. The phrase, the day of the Lord, gets used, which is going to become a very important idea in later theology, both for Jewish people and for Christians. But there's this idea in Amos that you've longed for. You wanted the day of the Lord to come, but when it actually gets here, you're going to find out it's not good for you. What's the metaphor? It's like someone fled from a lion and met a bear. So there's this idea that the enemies are out there, and you're running to God to be protected, and you find that God is actually the enemy you should have been afraid of.
It's going to be a very, very, very bad day.
Yeah, the day of the Lord is darkness, not light. That's what it says. We've talked a lot about kind of end times prophecy and what in Christian churches is called eschatology, the things that happen as the world ends. Is the day of the Lord a phrase that was still being used in your churches or that you've heard through your life, or is that was that not an operative
Well, the
metaphor?
only thing it would have referred to, I don't remember it specifically, but it would have referred to specifically the return of Jesus. That's the day of the Lord.
Yeah.
It's the only day of the Lord.
Yeah.
And it's good for the church.
Sometimes I think we grew up in the same church, because I was going to say the exact same thing there. The only reference to it was in terms of the second coming of Jesus, and no spelling. Well, what exactly is the day of the Lord, other than the second coming? And as you say, that was viewed to be a good thing. We good people are all going to, be raptured to heaven, and, it'd all be great for us, and the bad people are going to suffer like they deserve to suffer.
Yeah. They meet the bear,
Right.
but we'll be gone.
Yeah.
But the prophet is like almost predicting a cognitive dissonance for God's people. Like, whoa, we weren't raptured. We are stuck here. What happened?
Yeah. So one of the things I think is interesting about this passage and the scholarship on it is that the idea of the day of the Lord keeps evolving for Israel. Like even before Christian theology, and certainly before evangelical end times theology, like the day of the Lord had become a kind of firmly established idea that this is when the Son of Man comes back in the clouds, right? And some Jewish people in kind of the early or the late temple periods, this is what they were waiting for. They were waiting for the day of the Lord, meaning God's going to come, the Messiah is coming, the Son of Man is coming to set things right on the earth. But scholars debate about whether that's actually what Amos has in mind. Because probably when that phrase is first being used, it just means the festival days. Like these are just high holy days in the year. The day of the Lord is the day when we all get together to make our sacrifices or to read the scriptures. It's like a big festive worship service rather than this eschatological event. And it's not really clear what Amos had. Like Amos is part of that evolution of the idea, right? Amos is taking this liturgical idea, this phrase that refers to how we worship together, And he's saying, no, God is going to show up. You're invoking God in worship. And when God actually shows up, you're going to be terrified.
And disoriented. Yeah.
And quite disoriented. Yeah. And that brings us to the last section, and probably the most famous section of this chapter. I think this passage is quoted as often as anything in the Old Testament, maybe, or at least among some Christians in the 21st century. But it really is about worship, and whether God likes or wants the worship that the people of Israel are bringing. And it starts with kind of this really strong, really famous line. God says, I hate your festivals. I hate the way you celebrate the day of the Lord.
I hate your music.
It does say that.
Mm-hmm.
Did that get read a lot in your churches?
Oh, every Sunday, right before we sang the doxology, you know.
Or right before special music.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah.
I mean, I hated some of that music.
Probably
me and God reason. Maybe we have the same reaction.
So in ancient Israel, you would have had worship would have been kind of a complicated and highly structured thing. Certainly not like a Sunday morning worship service in a Christian church. You had systems of sacrifice, which is what people, I think Christians maybe especially think of. But you also had ritual, which might feel more familiar. You would have had something like congregational singing, or at least songs sung, instruments played during a time of worship. And what do you make the God says, I hate this. I hate the way it sounds.
Yeah, just to take it to the next level, I hate the instruments you're using too. I hate the sound of your harp. It's just to me, I would imagine just hearing those words would not, it's like, how could that be true? What we worship God. That's what we're doing. And that would seem like a very, very bizarre idea that God wouldn't like what we're doing.
Yeah, very bizarre. I think it would be totally compounding to a lot of Christians. How does, in your experience, how does music function in Christian communities, especially, or in religious spaces?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah, sure. And Jay, I know this is kind of an area of personal interest and expertise for you.
Yeah. Well, I think music is largely communal and meant to provoke, maybe is the right word, similar emotions among all of the participants. Particularly, I think that is true of modern worship music. It's meant to facilitate a sense of connection and certain emotional feelings. And modern worship music, of course, is an outgrowth of contemporary Christian music, which is the book that I authored that you referenced at the beginning of the podcast, where my co-author John Streck and I were doing what was really the first socio-cultural mapping of the genre known as contemporary Christian music. We were writing in the late 90s, book published in 1999, so it was sort of at the peak of contemporary Christian music. I believe at the time it was the fifth best-selling genre of music in the world.
Wow, I didn't know it peaked that
before
high.
File sharing destroyed basically most of recorded music and made the industry really turn topsy-turvy. But at the time, we were trying to figure out, what is contemporary Christian music? Because as one of the first things we had to say is, well, it's not a particular musical style or sound. There is no musical signature that you would hear just the music and say, oh, well, that's contemporary Christian. It's not like blues music or rap music or hip hop or jazz where you hear a certain sound and you recognize, okay, I know what genre of music I'm listening to. Contemporary Christian music, or CCM, was different because it could be anything.
Yeah.
And it's really more about tying the music to a particular text or lyrics, as well as a context, a social setting. And Christian music was not monolithic. There are these varying patches of approaches to it. We used, and stop me when I'm boring you,
I'm not bored yet.
Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture as a way of organizing our thinking around contemporary Christian music. That, as Niebuhr suggested, there's the Christ against culture approach, that the world is evil, and what you as Christians are obligated to do is come apart and be separate. And so we called that strand of CCM separational Christian music. So it's evangelical in orientation, calling people to convert, but at least that's part of the rationale and justification. But in terms of practice, it actually became more of reassuring the faithful, those who already believe. Bob Hartman, who was a guitar player, singer, songwriter for one of the early Christian rock bands, Petra, talked about, well, my job is to put Sunday school themes to song, right? So it did become very Sunday school, rather trite in my view, but it's about come out and be separate from the world. And when you're wearing a Petra shirt instead of a Van Halen shirt, it shows that you are separate and different somehow. The other strand that was perhaps the most successful is kind of taking Niebuhr's Christ of culture and the argument that at least the best intentions, the best ideals of society are very consistent with a Christian slash godly worldview. So Christians experience all aspects of life, right? Not just religion. So Christians can sing love songs to their spouse or significant other. And this is where you kind of get the Amy Grants of the world.
Sure.
This sort of positive pop that in many ways, I mean, we can talk about the CCM motif of the Becky, the minivan driving mother, stay-at-home mom of children moving into adolescence and wanting to create a very safe environment for them, and became the target demographic of contemporary Christian music. So we've got the separationalists, the world is bad and evil, you need to come apart. You've got what we referred to as the integrational CCM, at least aligning with the highest ideals of culture are consistent with Christianity. And then where perhaps a theologian would say we did Niebuhr injustice, we took his last three and lumped them into a separate category that we referred to as transformational contemporary Christian music. In many ways, the transformational artists sounded more like the prophets. You could get lament. You could get the critique of society. My personal favorite singer-songwriter is Terry Scott Taylor, who was in the band Daniel Amos in the middle 1970s and then going on. Ironically, their most popular album was called Shotgun Angel. The side 2 of the LP was this sort of musical adaptation of the eschatological view of the Book of Revelation, very popular at the time, but grew and changed and evolved over time to where, did a song called "I Didn't Build It for Me," taking televangelists to task. They're building these empires. I didn't build it for me. It's really for you. I didn't build it for me. So you get this critique of not only society but also of the church. Of applying that lens to evaluating and questioning ourselves. And I think that is in the tradition of the prophets. Now, about 2000, CCM peaked, right?
Right.
And began a very steady downward slope, right?
Just
So
in terms of
decline.
its presence in the market, the amount of money that was being made, the
Exactly.
number of artists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, was as and a lot of popular music as well, because with the start of file sharing,
Yeah, the whole
it
industry changes
just turned
around
the
that.
industry on its head. But what did survive then was modern worship music, which CCM has sort of become modern worship music.
Yeah.
And the artists that were doing other things, are having Kickstarter campaigns to put out their next record. And that modern worship music grew very much out of the charismatic Pentecostal tradition. Again, about that shared emotional experience, and singing about God and about the characteristics of God, perhaps, but losing the self-critique, confession, losing lamentation, weeping over what we see around us, and became this very personalized, me and Jesus kind of experience. But and again, maybe that's not entirely fair, because it is a corporate experience trying to generate the same sense of emotion in that experience.
I don't know if this is a question you can answer, but I would ask it kind of to you as a sociologist. Maybe it's a two-part question, which is, why do religious people sing to begin with? Like, why is music part of our relationship to God, or the way we express our religiosity? How would you answer that question? And then how do you think the creators of worship music, or the people who stand in the sanctuaries or the auditoriums and sing, what do you think, as a sociologist, what do you think is going on?
Well,
And as a worshiper, how do you describe what you're doing and why?
Well, I think artists in general give voice to feelings and expressions that we have a hard time articulating. That is why a particular song or a particular genre of music resonates with you as an individual, is they are articulating and giving voice to something that maybe you have felt but could not articulate. I think that's often where so many great songwriters struggle with depression, because they feel things so deeply and intensely. They're able to articulate things that we feel but cannot put into words. And I think when it comes to the church and why do people of faith sing, I think it is about two things. One is, as I mentioned, creating that shared emotional experience, but also that sense of community, that we're in this together, that we share these same worldviews, these same struggles, these same triumphs, these same doubts, these same beliefs. So it helps with the corporate aspect of faith and belief.
I sometimes joke that that at least some really religious people, who would tell you how much they love God and love worshiping God and how important that is in their life, sometimes joke that what they really love is music and concerts and being together, hearing good music and feeling that sense of togetherness. Like can be a transcendent experience no matter what the music is about.
Right. And I think that's true of your average rock concert
Right.
or rap
Yeah.
concert. It's a transcendent shared experience.
Yeah. You want to say, like, go to a concert, like go to a really good concert. And you might find that same thing and even better, or even more.
So here's a question that my experience with contemporary Christian music is, it seemed like second class music to me. So why is it that from your perspective, the church would embrace a form of music that kind of lacks that artistic quality that speaks to those deeper questions.
Yeah, I think it is true that that a lot of CCM was very derivative because it was being used in a utilitarian sort of fashion. That as Bob Hartman said, the point is to remind the faithful
Right.
of what they believe, get Sunday school lessons in music, and we're going to pretend we're going to convert people with this. And it's very doubtful whether that ever really happened. And I think because CCM would always chase whatever trends were hot at the moment. If there's some breakout band, well, we need a Christian version of that band, which inevitably won't be as good as that band, but we can claim if you like Black Sabbath, we've got Striper, we've got white metal that instead of black metal, and so you can make those claims because they're using it not art for art's sake, recognizing that, I think one of the things about the group we would call transformational artists is they take their cue from Genesis 1, that humans are made in the image of God. Well, what is God doing in Genesis 1? He's being creative. So anytime you're being creative, creating art in this case, you are reflecting that divine image of God. You don't have to have Sunday school lyrics in order to be reflecting the divine image of God. But that was not the dominant view in CCM. It was much more about, well, our job is to, reinforce the beliefs of the faithful or to convert the masses. And so therefore, the music isn't really important. It doesn't have to be particularly good. I think it's unfair to say all CCM is bad. There were times Petra did some pretty good stuff.
There's still
and there were
not
times
as
when it was really trite as well. Right?
yeah, but I still preferred Led Zeppelin.
Okay, yeah, well,
which is
it's
not
hard
really
to
a
beat
fair
Led Zeppelin,
comparison.
right?
But that's the question. Why was there never a Led Zeppelin of contemporary Christian music?
Well, because I think if you call it CCM, then it gets pigeonholed into a market that you can. And I would say there was. I would say it's U2. You've got
that's an interesting
got a
comparison.
band that was the world's greatest rock and roll band for about a decade there.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But they didn't. They managed to avoid ever getting pigeonholed with the contemporary Christian music label. And not everybody in the band claimed to be a Christian. But it did show through in their music. So.
But you wouldn't hear U2 songs in worship.
Oh no. Well,
you
maybe, right?
I think in some context,
Yeah.
I remember when I was in college, we were invited to participate in a U2 Eucharist, which was exactly what it sounds like.
I've
It's a
never heard of
communion
that.
service
I'd love
where
to
the
go to
liturgy
one of those.
is built around U2 songs. I didn't go. I wasn't like a huge U2 fan, and it did not sound like the thing for me. But it's a great example, and probably because they were so legitimately talented, because they weren't a product of the CCM machine, like they were on a mainstream label. They had found success in the marketplace, but the themes are there. Like they are as the music and the lyrics are as Christian as almost
right.
as
I remember
many things.
being at a U2 concert in the late 1980s. I think it was the Joshua Tree tour, and they ended with the song 40, which was actually on the album War, which is Psalm 40, which is a lament. How long must we sing this song? And the whole arena is singing along with them. And one by one, the members of U2 leave the stage. And lastly, it's, Bono out there, leading, and then he leaves. And it's still the whole arena still singing,
man.
How long must we sing this song? That lamentation that is, basically a direct quote of Psalm 40. Also, Leah Payne in her recent book on the history of contemporary Christian music. It's called "Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music?" Borrowing the title from a Larry Norman song. But she talks about youth ministers using U2's "I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For" as an altar call song.
Right.
I'm sure that's not what the band had in mind, but there were certain youth pastors who were using it in that way.
Here's a question. So back to the Amos, there seems to be this obliviousness, if that's a fair word, of the worshipers that Amos is speaking to about the fact that their art isn't jiving with God's vision. And for some reason, God didn't like what they're doing. And that raises a good question is, does God like contemporary Christian music or?
Well, does God like any music? I think that's the question I was thinking about too. Like, religious people sing for all these different reasons. And as the sociologist, you can see like what religious music accomplishes. And it could be a lot of things. And we talked about, I think, most of them. But theologically, we would say, or people of faith might say, we sing because God likes it. That God wants to hear us sing. That it's one of the sacrifices, it's one of the offerings that religious people bring to God. So I do want to and we don't have to focus on CCM, although we certainly can answer that question if you want. But what does it mean to say that God likes when we sing? What does it mean to say that God cares? And certainly, thinking about Amos 5, what does it mean to say God hates this? Like, does God hate it because it sucks as music, because it's bad art? Or what does Amos say? Why does God hate this music? I just asked like 7 different questions. So take your pick.
Well, I'm not going to try to answer it in terms of theology. I'll leave that to the theologians here. But I think it's not necessarily about the music or the quality of the music. It's about the lack of practice, behaviors that God expects, and it's that incongruity. I think we see it again in Matthew 25 of the sheep and the goats, and Jesus says, I was hungry and you didn't feed me, and I was naked and you didn't clothe me, and I was in prison and you didn't come to visit me. And the response is, well, when did we ever see you doing that? And then he talks about the least of these. And so again, I see the faithful being shocked that, well, wait a minute, you mean we got it wrong here? We're the ones who are right. What do you mean you're telling us we got it wrong? And I think it's that inconsistency and hypocrisy that sours the music.
I remember reading Kierkegaard, and he had this idea of worship that I don't remember which one of his books, but he suggested sometime to reorient the entire congregation so that God is the audience.
Right. Yeah.
God
Kierkegaard's
is in the
famous idea.
pews.
Who is the question?
Yeah.
Who is the audience of our worship, and who's performing it?
And I, in my own experience, most of the time, I never really felt like God was the audience. I mean, I think you think about how central Sunday morning is to Christian life. And I mean, I think it's a direct parallel here is when you view it that way, when your religious life is oriented around this stuff, but divorced from the world, God isn't going to like it no matter how it sounds. To me, that's a question. I imagine a lot of people out there that aren't Christian or religious at all probably wonder the same thing. Oh, y'all are doing all that stuff in that building, but we don't appreciate the way you come across to us out there in the real world.
Yeah, it's the discrepancy between like what we say. I mean, hypocrisy is the word
Mhm.
for it, right? It's we say these things, we claim these values, but then the the practical impact of your life is bad for so many people. You ignore things or contribute to things that make society worse or that make others more vulnerable.
I mean,
And I think
oh, go ahead.
sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to jump in and first say, who am I to question Kierkegaard? But I would argue that modern worship would argue they have made God the audience, but they still have limited the range of topics that can be addressed. Modern worship music is a lot about, praising God for the attributes of God and completely forgets confession, repentance, and lamentation. That God should also be the audience of those things, as well as simply the object of our praise and affection. So I think when you quote Kierkegaard, I think people that write modern worship music would say, well, we've done it. We've got it figured out. Scott, we've got
That's
it
all
under
we're
control.
doing.
Who are
Yeah.
you to criticize us? But I think the range of topics has been so narrowed that it becomes artificial.
Well, and I would think that good so-called Christian music, it should connect out there. That's what art is. There's a universal aspect to art. And if it's not, you almost have to ask the question, was it really art? Is what we're doing, I don't know how to say that any better. What do you think?
Well, first I would say good art or good music is subjective and very much driven by cultural context, I mean, everybody thinks the best music ever created was the music that was popular between the time they were age 14 to age 22.
But that is
Right.
true in our case.
Right, it is true in our case, right? We're classic rock fans, right? Right. So you've got this kind of very subjective. There's a certain age at which music
so
resonates
formative,
with
yeah.
people, and then we sort of stop listening to anything else after age 22. So it is very contextually driven what is and isn't good art and what is quality. And so I'm hesitant to appoint myself the judge of what is good art. So.
Of course, yeah. And I think Amos is part of a really interesting and a long-running conversation about these things we've been talking about, which is what is the relationship between our religious acts, our self-consciously religious acts of worship, the offerings we bring to God, and the way we live our lives and order society when we're not at church or temple or wherever it is. And I don't think there's a really easy answer to that. Like, those things never line up perfectly, right? And I don't think Amos is saying I don't think Amos is saying you should throw out all the liturgy, you should stop going to church because you can't align perfectly your ethics and your impact on society with the values you claim. But Amos is saying that your religious acts might become offensive to God.
Because they're divorced from justice. It's becomes self-centered. It's all about the people gathered in the temple.
But isn't that always true?
Well, yeah, but that makes you wonder. It's almost like, well, then, could any of our music be, appreciated by God if it's so self-centered?
Yeah, right. I think maybe God hates it all. Or I think maybe Amos thinks God hates it all. Like, can't quite come out and say that. But this passage gets used in so many ways, like through the centuries, like everybody sees their enemies in this passage, right? This is a classic Protestant text to critique the Catholic Church, and it'd say, "Oh, your empty rituals. You've missed the theological boat, and so you can burn all the incense you want, but God doesn't like it because you're doing it wrong, or you're doing something else wrong." And I think that's like a perennial critique that religious people make of other religious people, and ultimately, I'm not totally sure it's helpful. I'm rambling.
Well, how many hymns of lament are in any standard Christian hymnal? There's no section. There's a section on salvation, a section on the Holy Spirit. Where's the section on lament?
I contributed a book chapter to a volume that was doing textual analyses of the most popular songs used in corporate worship over like a 10-year period. So this may have been like between 2000 and 2010. And I took the theme of justice, and I could find one song.
Oh, no.
Out of the top, I forget what it was, 50 or 100. There was one song that seemed, if you looked at it just right and squinted your eye, there was a justice theme in there. But it was basically absent from those.
And Amos wouldn't like that.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah,
No. As someone who selects songs for worship every week, I mean, like, this is part of my day job, is worship planning and leadership, and it's hard to find hymns, and then it's especially hard to find more contemporary, more modern choruses, songs that touch on any themes besides how great God is. Like, we just love God so much.
Well, then how often would it be the case that after a worship service, the people that were there would leave and ask, "Boy, I wonder if God liked this today"?
So what do you think? I think we've kind of been talking around this. Maybe we've even said it, but what's the alternative? What's Amos? Where does he finally come down? How do you read this last section of the chapter, or looking at the chapter as a whole? What do you think what is this chapter trying to tell people to do? What would Amos prefer to hypocritical worship, sacrifices, and songs?
Well, one thing, which is true of all the prophets, is that the role of God's people is to be a transformational, redemptive, life-giving group of people in the world. That's part of the whole biblical vision. If you were to ask me, what is our role? It is to be a redemptive people. And I think what Amos is saying is none of that is a part of what you're doing. Justice is about society, and that's the thing they've given up. So worship that doesn't address those things is problematic, and yet we don't even attend to that, I don't feel like. Or rarely one song.
Right.
Yeah, I think, and maybe this is simply rephrasing what you just said, Scott. I think that bringing behavior, the expected behavior, in line with your worship, at the risk of confusing things by introducing a different prophet, Micah says, what's required of us as humans, but to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. Now, I will say the one that gets those of us on the progressive end of the political spectrum is the walk humbly part.
Right.
We're really good at telling other people you're not doing it right, and not enough self-critique. I know I'm guilty of that.
Well, how humble was Micah that that wrote that, right?
Yeah. That's an interesting irony there. You've got that as well. But to try to bring those things into consistency with each other rather than in opposition, worship without justice. But also, I think people that are very pro-justice can be very unlikable people. They're always condemning everybody, and you're never good enough, kind of thing. So, that's the critique I have to keep bringing to myself. Is that okay? Wait a minute, right? What am I doing here?
Well, and I would say most of the prophets were miserable human beings, and they didn't.
You mean for everyone else or for
no,
themselves?
I mean, I think they were depressed, like, God, I hate this job. Jeremiah, who said, cursed be the day I was born. I wish somebody would have run a sword through my mother's womb rather than me being born.
Well, it is kind of a depressing job. I mean, this passage ends on a really depressing note. There's the really uplifting lines, which have been quoted again and again. Famously, we're recording this on MLK Day, and most famously, I think this line, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty rolling stream, is quoted by MLK. And it's such a powerful image, a beautiful idea. But then Amos kind of says, but that's not what you did. That's not what you're going to do. And this tragedy is coming because of it. I think for me, this is part of such an interesting conversation in the Bible itself about whether our worship itself has any value in a world that can't do justice. And I think the prophets kind of, at least Micah and Amos, kind of come down on the side of it doesn't matter. Your religious life is useless. It doesn't justify you, or it doesn't make God love you anymore, or it doesn't work.
Well,
but
Isaiah
then those
speaks to this, what temple can you build for me? What worship facility can you build for me? Is not heaven my throne and earth my footstool? So from God's perspective, worship has this grand, like, universal perspective that the God we worship is the God of all creation, and worship should somehow conjure up that sense in us, and that we should feel a deep solidarity with the world, and our worship should like facilitate that way of looking at the world. And what Amos is saying is, but your worship doesn't do that. You're trying to squeeze God into a building. And I mean, isn't that, most Christians, most of their religious experience happens on a Sunday, right? As if that's where you go to meet God. And I think the prophets question that whole line of thinking at the core.
I do too. But then I don't know if it's ironic, it's at least interesting that then we take this writing and stick it in the Bible, which we read mostly in church. So reading these texts that are pretty critical of the whole enterprise becomes something we mostly do in worship.
If we read them at all.
Well, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, part of my experience, growing up in evangelical churches, we rarely, if ever, read particularly the minor prophets, but the prophets in general.
Yeah, that's
and
a really good
rarely, if ever, took a serious look at the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
So, we avoid sections of the Bible that make us uncomfortable.
Well, I know there's a lot we haven't talked about. There's more we could go into with this chapter. But I also know we've been talking for a long time, and we wanted to focus especially on this last section and this idea of music and worship, since we had Jay here to share a little bit of his expertise. But final thoughts? Anything else you're thinking about? Anything we've missed or you would want to mention as we wrap up?
For me, it's a question like, wonder what a worship experience that God would really appreciate look like. I mean, what would the songs be? What would the format be? I mean, it's just one, I can't begin to imagine what Amos would have thought was at least respectable worship.
Yeah.
I,
I definitely don't know how Amos would have answered that question. I personally, as a person of faith who's also trying to live in the real world and take the Bible seriously, I like the idea that God is happy when we're happy, and that there is some value in that collective experience when it's honest and when it's and when we recognize all the shortcomings. I think there's something really powerful to that God likes our good music, God likes our bad music, God likes that we try. And there's something special about that.
but we have to acknowledge that it is just an attempt.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Any final thoughts, questions, things we missed?
Well, I think we've thoroughly explored the topic here, so I appreciate the opportunity to be in dialogue with you two.
Yeah,
we
really appreciate
it too. We play a game at the end of every episode, and we might be playing with fire. I guess we'll find out someday. The game is called Take It or Leave It, which is pretty much what it sounds like. This chapter from the Bible, as you think about what we've read, what we've talked about, and your own personal practice and preference, if you were creating a Bible for yourself that informs the way you live, would you take this or would you leave it? Is there something helpful here or not enough that you would want to carry it along the way? And so you don't have to go first. You don't have to go first. No. Well, those are the rules. That's the game. You have to pick one or the other. You have to either take it or leave it, and you cannot cut it apart. You've got to either take the whole thing or leave it all.
I'll take it, but don't tell any of my Christian friends because I don't want them to know that. Oh. It's I'll take it, but I realize it's this passage is a huge tension, creates a huge tension. But that's why I would want to keep it. The cognitive dissonance, I think, is productive.
Yeah. It's take it for me too. There are things, we will come back to some of the topics that this passage raises again and again. We haven't talked today about the violence in it, the idea that a lot of that violence is initiated by God. That's a challenge we can talk about. We will talk about as we keep moving through the Bible. But I take this one just for raising the question: does God hate worship? And Amos is willing to say, yeah, probably.
I'm on the take it side as well. Realize in some ways that this chapter may feel like, some bad tasting medicine, but medicine we really need nonetheless.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jay, for being here, for everything you've shared, for the time you spent with us. We also want to say a huge thank you to Nick Mandog Smith for producing and editing this show. Thank you to our executive producer, Jay Kennedy. And thank you to all the scholars whose work we've used and that has informed this episode. Even if you couldn't tell, we have done a lot of research. I personally want to say thank you to the congregation of First Baptist Church of Indianapolis, where I serve as one of the pastors and am able to do things like this. Scott, anyone you want to thank?
I want to thank my wife for encouraging me to do this. You mentioned imposter syndrome earlier on, and I think even doing this was hard for me. And so somebody that encourages me to do something like that. My wife, I really appreciate.
Jay, I know you're very busy with lots of things during the work week. Do you have anything coming up, anything coming out, books in the works, or things people should check out if they're interested?
Nothing in the works coming out in the short term. You know, you can still find Apostles of Rock floating around on the internet there if you put your mind to it. Scott did, so you can find it if you're interested.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. And of course, we want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us as well. Please remember to rate, review, and or subscribe. If there's a chapter from the Bible that you want to hear more about, you can send us an email at unholybiblestudypodcast@gmail.com. If you have questions, you can send those there too. If you hate this and everything about it, or think we're going to hell, you don't have to email us, but I suppose you can if you absolutely must. Scott, next week we are talking about Galatians 2. What should people expect?
That Paul is one of the most convoluted writers in the Bible there is, and it's very difficult to figure out what he means.
Fireworks in the early church. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all. Thank you both for being here. And as always, we did not invite you to church.
Great ending there.